Okay, good evening, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to our CAWASA Wednesday webinars for water and wastewater operators in the Caribbean. And this evening, we again pleased to have the team from the Operators Without Borders collaborating with us to present this webinar. We have with us Ms. Valerie Jenkinson, who is the president of the Operators Without Borders. And we also have Ms. Aria Drucker, who is an intern with Operators Without Borders. And our presenter this evening is Mr. Bodimeade, sorry. Carl is a senior vice president with Hatch Infrastructure based in Ontario, Canada. He's currently chair of the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association's Utility Leadership Committee and is regularly invited to moderate and participate in expert panels on subjects such as infrastructure funding, the value of water, sustainability, and urban resiliency. Carl has over 35 years of experience in project management, engineering, and planning for a wide range of projects in the water and wastewater, urban infrastructure, and brownfield development, and power sectors. So I'd like to welcome Carl, and he's going to present on a paper that he's been working on for some time with Valerie towards a sustainable utility, guidance for water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities. Over to you, Carl.
Okay, thanks very much, Ignatius, and thanks very much for the invitation, to speak to your group. Thanks also as well to Valerie for connecting us, and looking forward to presenting to you this afternoon, and looking forward to some discussions after. Just before I begin, can everybody see my screen okay, and can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
okay,
loud and clear.
Very good. Okay, so also as well, I hope everybody's staying well in these challenging times. It's certainly been an unusual year, and hopefully we're coming through to the other side of it though, and hopefully everybody's managed to stay safe and well. So my topic tonight is towards the sustainable utility. As Ignatius mentioned, this is a document that we've been working on in the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association for about 18 months or so now. It was just published back in March, and hopefully it'll be of interest to the audience tonight. So my agenda this afternoon, evening, is I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association, a very similar initials and acronym to the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association. Then I'm going to talk about Utility Leadership Committee, which I chair, CWWA's position on what a sustainable water utility should be. And then I'll get into some detail about the guidance document we developed. And then we'll hopefully have some time left at the end for questions, and look forward to discussion with you. So the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association, or CWWA, is the national, by national obviously I mean Canadian, voice of the water and wastewater industry in Canada. And the type of issues we work on and advocate for is infrastructure renewal, financing, replacement and growth, adaptation and innovation. And I'm sure some of these issues will be very, very familiar to people in the Caribbean too. The value of water. Water is often an undervalued resource. Public attitudes and getting their buy-in, to recognize the value of water. Smart customers, that's certainly something we're seeing in Canada now. People, water and wastewater utility customers want to be more informed, they demand more information, and they're asking that water utilities be more accountable. Obviously, climate change is another issue that we're very much involved in. We've hosted flood risk roundtables. Excuse me, adaptation as well. How can utilities best be prepared for a changing climate? Whatever that changing climate is very much uncertain right now. greenhouse gas reduction. We recognize that utilities are a large electricity power user. What can we do as utilities to help mitigate greenhouse gas emissions? Source water protection as well. There's more and more realization that natural infrastructure, source water protection is very important. And one of the things that has happened here recently is the federal government. We have a federal provincial type arrangement where the provinces have most of the jurisdiction and most of the mostly responsible for ensuring water quality and regulations to do with water. But the federal government has an overview, an oversight role. And the federal government has recently tabled the idea of forming a Canada Water Agency. Obviously, as the CWWA, as the advocate for water and wastewater issues across Canada, we would very much like to be involved in advising the government as to the mandate and how that jurisdiction of that Canada Water Agency and how it should go about its business. As part of that, we obviously carry out quite a bit of outreach to our members. Obviously, we have a website recently revamped. I encourage you to visit it. Robert Haller, our executive director, is very much on top of producing monthly e-bulletins, a biannual magazine. And we have two major events each year. Unfortunately, last year they were both had to be held virtually. And it looks like it might be the same this year, actually, unfortunately. But we have what we call a window on Ottawa. Ottawa is where our federal government resides, and this is the opportunity for water and wastewater staff and leaders to chat with the federal representatives who are responsible for legislation, initiatives, funding as well. So that is always held in Ottawa in Ontario. And then we have a national conference which rotates around various parts of Canada. This year, actually, it's going to be in Niagara Falls, which is very, very close to where I live. But we've also had conferences in St. John's, Newfoundland, on the East Coast, Montreal, and Quebec, Vancouver, and so on and so forth. Now, CWWA, within CWA, we have 7 committees. I've listed them here. I won't describe them in detail. I think that the titles are pretty self-explanatory, but these are where really a lot of the technical work and the advocacy work gets formulated. Robert and his team looks after CWW as a whole, and the committees are made up largely of volunteers with a liaison to the board. And so those committees are wastewater and stormwater, water efficiency, water reduction, as it were. Security and emergency management is a much more critical task or critical issue right now. I think you may have heard about the water utility in Florida, which recently got hacked, okay, and had their their operations interrupted. And just in the last few weeks or so, there was a major gas pipeline on the US East Coast, which was basically subject to ransom demands from hackers. Okay, so it's becoming a much more critical issue. Drinking water, climate change, obviously a big issue, biosolids, and lastly, the Utility Leadership Committee, which is the committee that I chair, and I've got a great team of volunteers working for me, one of which is Valerie. So the mandate of the Utility Leadership Committee is to provide a forum for managers and senior staff of public utilities to discuss the challenges in utility management. So this isn't so much a technical committee as more the business, in inverted commas, okay, of a water utility. So it's to do with the finance, the rates, okay, for water and wastewater services, the operational issues such as workforce workforce demographics, workforce retirements, and issues such as that. And we really just formed about 3 years ago or so, so it's relatively new. I won't say young committee because we're all getting on a bit, but it's a relatively new committee, and we tackled a number of objectives, a number of initiatives, okay, over the last few years. One being the sustainable water services and the guidance document, which I'll be discussing further in the presentation. So before we developed a guidance document for the use and interest, okay, of CWWA's membership, which, by the way, encompasses water and wastewater utilities across Canada, we had to develop a position statement. What is CWWA's position on sustainable water services? And we came up with quite a bit of discussion and lots of emails going back and forth and meetings, etc. We came up with this position statement. I'm going to read it out because I think it's quite important, and then I'll go over some of the key points later. So CWWA's position statement on sustainable water services is that a sustainable water service recognizes and incorporates social, service level and affordability, environmental and economic factors while ensuring full cost recovery and intergenerational equity. There are many benefits to communities where utilities provide sustainable water services, and by water service we mean water, wastewater, and or stormwater. Some of our membership are just water utilities, some are just wastewater, some cover the whole gamut. Over the long term, there may also be significant risks to public health, local economies, and the environment if water services are not truly sustainable. However, there are a number of key challenges or barriers to achieving sustainable water services. Utilities should plan to move closer to sustainable water services, recognizing those challenges and monitor their progress to that objective. Communication with and engagement of the public and elected officials as the social, environmental, and economic value of water services will be essential in that process. So that's a lot of words. I've sort of boiled it down to a number of key points. Basically, we wanted to point out the benefits to the communities and customers if water services are sustainable, the risks if they are not. And that could be public health issues, environmental degradation, infrequent service, perhaps economic impacts as well due to industries having their water supply interrupted. We want to recognize that it's not just social, environmental, or economic factors which really factor into the sustainability of water services. Full cost recovery is a very important principle. Some of you may have heard of that already. I'll be talking about that, excuse me, in more detail further in the presentation, but it's essentially recovery of the full cost of providing water services. We wanted to make people aware and recognize ourselves that we're not, a lot of water utilities are not there yet. I regard sustainability as a journey. You start where you are now, and there's a project out there. Some people, some utilities are further along that journey than others. And there are challenges. We need to be honest about that. We need to recognize those challenges and do our best to overcome them. And lastly, the communication with public and elected officials as to the value of water services is essential. In essence, for a water utility, it has a number of stakeholders. One, obviously a big stakeholder is the public, customers, and also the elected officials or directors, which actually govern the water utility. We need to communicate, engage those stakeholders as to the value of water services. So those are the key points. Excuse me, just going to get a drink here. those are the key points in our position statement. And we found that our position statement is a very good touchstone, a very good base, okay, on which we can refer to when an issue comes up. We can go back to that position statement and use it as a guide, okay, for any responses, any communications, any reactions, and advocacy as well, okay, to the importance of sustainable water services. So after much talking, we arrived at the position statement, and then we thought, well, that's great. Okay, we've got a position statement now. How do we make that really, okay, to our membership? How can we turn that a few paragraphs or so into something that a utility manager or leader can for help in guiding his or her utility towards a sustainable model? So we decided that a guidance document would be a good way of communicating that. And by guidance document, it's a guideline. It's not a code or a strict way of doing about it. We recognize that our membership, and I'm sure it's the same there. Our membership is made up of a wide range of utilities, some very large, okay, with lots of resources, and some really quite small, okay, which the resources may be restricted. They have very good intentions. They run good water and wastewater services, but their ability to take on additional work or to look at strategic initiatives may be quite limited. So we didn't want something which was a cookie cutter approach, something which would be the same for everybody. We wanted to give people, give utilities guidance so that they could then take that guidance and adapt it to their own particular situation needs. Okay. The objective of the guidance document, and I think Valerie may have distributed it to your membership already, or at least a link to it, was to offer guidance for navigating towards being sustainable and resilient water services. So the first question we came up with was really, okay, what do we mean by sustainable water services? What do we mean by sustainable water systems? How can that be encapsulated in a way which is relevant to the needs of our membership and hopefully other utilities? So we fell back or adopted the IWA, the International Water Association definition. And the IWA states that sustainable water systems should provide adequate water quantity and appropriate water quality for a given need, important points there, quantity and quality, without compromising the future ability to provide this capacity and quality. So I think that's an important point there, without compromising the future ability. It's somewhat akin to driving a car. If you drive a car very aggressively and never change the oil in the engine, eventually that car is going to break down. If you drive sensibly, you maintain and invest, okay, in that car and the right operations and maintenance, it will give you years of good service. So within that, the threefold goals of 1, economic feasibility, social responsibility, environmental integrity are linked to the purpose of water use. So you see a lot of commonality here between the IWA definition and the CWWA's position on water sustainability. Okay, no surprise there. I think it's the principles, okay, are very good, sensible. I think they're something which people can grasp, okay, which can understand. So I think it's important that the two match. Okay. So within that document, after a lot of discussion, a lot of drafts and ways to organize it. We wanted to make it a document which would be impactful. We didn't want it to be a document which is 4 volumes and people just park it on the shelf and never look at. We wanted to be concise. We wanted to be something which would make an impact and which would be of direct use. I was on a day-to-day basis, but on a monthly basis, okay, to a utility leader and staff. Okay, so in the end, it worked out to be about 30 pages or so. So not a substantial document, but not overly long. And we spent a lot of time with editors to make sure that the points came across. Okay, so the way we organized it was in 4 parts. Part 1 was challenges, considerations, and best practices. And I'll go into more detail on each of these parts in just a few minutes and further in slides. Part 2 is a full cost recovery framework. This is really a critical aspect, an essential aspect we felt of a sustainable utility. I'll describe what we meant by that in some detail later. Part 3 was influencing the adoption of plans. I mean, we can all develop plans, but unless the stakeholders, customers, governors, elected officials buy into those plans, then we might as well not develop them. So we wanted to make sure we communicated some principles whereby our membership could get those stakeholders, get buy-in from the stakeholders and move those plans forward. Okay. Part 4 is moving forward, and during the development of the guidance document, we became pretty obvious there were some issues which there were not a lot of research, a lot of resources, a lot of support at that time. And one thing we wanted to do in the document was provide examples and further resources that if somebody is particularly interested in a subject, whether it be workforce or utility management, they can consult additional resources to for further reading, get some more ideas, etc. But on the number of subjects, we really felt that there wasn't a lot of resources or support at this time, perhaps because there are emerging issues or just such wide issues. And so we wanted to identify those for future initiatives and encourage more research, more work to be carried out in those particular aspects. So those are what we've highlighted in part 4. I believe there's 4 or 5 individual things we felt there should be more attention paid to in the future. So in, excuse me, in part 1, it's entitled Challenges, Considerations, Best Practices. In our particular situation in Canada, we felt there was 8 challenges which were particularly relevant to our membership. Your challenges down there in the Caribbean may be very similar, but I'm sure there's some which are quite different as well. Okay, but these were the 8 which really felt, our membership felt that they could do with some additional guidance and support on. And we split them into a number of different challenges, different types of challenge. Internal challenges related to our operations. What do we, okay, what can we control within our own utility or organization? Okay. Global challenges beyond our control. We can have some influence on those, but really they're beyond our control. Climate change, for example. Impacts of climate change is a good example of a global challenge. Every country, every nation is dealing, having to deal with that and will be having to deal with that to a much larger degree in our future as a global challenge. And then external challenges, which are related to our customers and stakeholders. These are not directly within the utility, but they are challenges which our customers and stakeholders face, okay, and therefore they will have some impact on our utility. And for each of those challenges, we talked about the description, the impacts. We talked about best practices, okay, what are the key points, okay, the best way that other utilities are dealing with this particular challenge. we wanted to give a key takeaway, just a very short and concise point that utilities or a utility leader would want to get from that. We wanted to give examples. Okay, these are real world examples, real members of CWWA who are tackling some of these challenges, okay, and having some success with them. Okay, and last, as I mentioned, I wanted to talk about support and resources. If this is a particular issue for a utility, where could staff in that utility go for additional information? And with the internet these days, there's so much information out there. We want to help our membership find the most relevant and practical resources rather than having to spend days looking for the right document. This hopefully will enable them to go to some useful and useful information very, very quickly and obtain some benefit from that. So I'm just going to go through the challenges, okay, that we identified, and I'm sure some of these will be very relevant, okay, to your membership in the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association. Aging and deteriorating infrastructure. I think that's a common issue around the world, really, in some jurisdictions, some municipalities, some cities, which are relatively old. Okay, I grew up just outside London, England. It's been there for almost thousands of years. There's a lot of deteriorating infrastructure. Other North American cities, they're grown very quickly, and a lot of their infrastructure relatively new, but they still got some older infrastructure, and that infrastructure is not getting any younger. Okay, it's deteriorating, some rapidly, some less so. Okay? And really, the key point in dealing with the issue of aging and deteriorating infrastructure is to have a robust asset management strategy. Okay, something whereby the age, the condition, and the investments, current aging condition of the infrastructure, and the investment which is required to provide the service levels going that the customers and stakeholders demand, okay, is made at the appropriate time, the appropriate amount, and the appropriate way. And really, asset management, in some cases, people can get a little bit worried about or hesitant about because they have visions of huge computer programs and software, etc. Doesn't necessarily have to be with that. We would encourage utilities to start with whatever data they have available right now. And some utilities that may be relatively small. Start with that. As you start to talk about and develop an asset management system and strategy, it becomes pretty clear where the data, most relevant data is missing and where the data gaps are. And that will allow utility to focus on those data gaps as a priority. Changing workforce demographics. One of the things that we're facing here is an aging workforce. We're having to attract younger people, new operators into the workforce. There's one statistic that 50% of our operational staff and management staff in water utilities will be retiring in the next 10 years. So that's a huge, excuse me, a huge effect, a huge challenge. There's certainly things that can be done in terms of information, communications, technologies, etc., to help that. But we do need to attract younger people, new operators into the workforce. And that can be both internal and external strategies. External strategies would be working with local community colleges, for example, to develop an operator course. Internal strategies could be to ensure that the workforce remains in the water utility, And it could be work sharing, it could be rotations to different roles, and obviously coaching, okay, and mentoring that staff to become more senior in their roles. Okay. First step we would recommend would be to carry out a gap analysis. Look at your workforce demographics right now. Who's going to be retiring in the next 5 to 10 years? Are there key people who have to replace? I mean, Joe or Jane, who carries the knowledge of every valve in the system up in their heads, okay? They're going to be retiring in 2 years. We need to do something now to allow the transfer of that institutional knowledge. Without carrying out a gap analysis, you may be carrying out a lot of initiatives or efforts which may be wasted. So, other challenges, climate change. I'm sure you're all aware, and the impacts of climate change. I'm sure it's going to be different to down there in the Caribbean that is up here in Canada, but it is something that will impact us all and our jobs and our utilities. Really, with climate change, we know it's happening. We don't know the full effects, though, okay, and what those effects are going to be. We've got lots of modeling out there, which shows what the impacts and the changes could be, but nobody is certain what it's exactly going to be. So rather than wait until it becomes more clear, we feel that utilities should start now, start to plan for climate change now, but they should use a flexible, iterative, and forgiving process so that if in a few years' time we find that the climate change effects are worse or hopefully better or different to what we anticipate now, that there can be a course correction and the process can change to accommodate that. Another challenge is source water protection. That's become more and more prevalent, and more people are aware of it. In that, a multi-barrier approach is very important. We can't rely just on one barrier to ensure water quality and the safety of our water supplies. And because source water protection can draw off a large watershed, it's very important to engage the community and landowners. Get them to be aware of the importance of their land holding, their property in ensuring clean and safe drinking water. Excuse me. Other challenges, rising energy costs. This is again a story the world over. There's energy is not getting any cheaper. Okay. In fact, it's going to keep increasing. Likely, there's going to be increasing demand. Okay, for energy, and certainly utilities here, municipalities here. The water utility is a major part of their energy usage in treatment, in pumping, and so on. Okay, so rising energy costs need to be factored into how we're going to make a water utility sustainable. So there can be some quick hits there. Just for example, leakage reduction. Every liter of water which is not lost to leakage means a liter of water which doesn't need to be pumped, and the energy involved in that avoided. The way to get stakeholders, elected officials involved in this is demonstrate net return. How can investment in energy management, how can that reduce the energy costs in the future? One of the things we're finding very much here in Canada, especially in the urban areas, is a changing pattern in water use. We're finding that the amount of water per capita water usage is continuing to decline over time, and significantly as well. Not a 5% decline, but it can be over the range of 10 years or so. 10 or 15% is significant, and because here that water utilities get a large majority of their revenue from water rates, which can be based on water usage. That's an large impact on, or can be a large impact on their revenue. To assess the change in that and factor that into a sustainability model needs long-range forecasting, and that can help develop a suitable rate structure whereby perhaps the majority of a water bill is a fixed cost, a block rate, okay, and then which allows for a certain amount of water usage, and anything over that is on a volumetric basis. So having a forecast will allow the most suitable rate structure to be developed. Now, I'm sure that's the case there, but water rates are continuing to increase because there is a recognition that water utilities require a certain amount of investment, and in some cases increasing investment, for them to continue providing the level of service that their customers demand. There is some challenge with lower income groups in terms of affordability. How can they how can a utility provide the water service which everybody is entitled to, but in a way whereby lower income groups are not disenfranchised or not cut off from water services? Really here, this is something that requires targeted programs rather than programs which apply to every customer. And it's important, we felt, to work with community social groups, one, to allow them to assist in developing the program, but also as well to engage with them and to get them on board in terms of make them aware of the efforts that the utility may be making to work with those customer groups. Certainly here in Canada, we're seeing increased customer expectations. It's not just a matter of them paying a water bill once a month anymore. They want access to information. How much water am I using? What is your utility doing about climate change? Excuse me. Why was there a sewage spill, okay, into this river recently? So a lot of expectations there in terms of better information, and we have to recognize that utilities need to provide that information. If you don't provide the information, then people make up the information. It's probably going to be worse than the actual situation. But we need to recognize the customer as a priority as well in terms of billing, access to information, and just as a stakeholder. So those are the 8 challenges we looked at in part 1. Part 2 is full cost recovery framework, and we feel this really is a critical aspect of becoming sustainable. So we talked about what is full cost recovery. It's a concept that the cost charged to the end user of water services reflects all the costs of providing those services. So everything which is required to develop water, okay, or deal with wastewater should be recognized and incorporated into the water services charges. Okay, now it means balancing a utility's total cost of providing the desired level of services with its revenue. So just the same as one balances one's own bank account, okay, a utility must be able to bring in enough investment through charges, funding, etc., to balance its outlays, okay, to its investment needs in a long-term sustainable manner. Again, in the bank account, you can keep drawing money out of the account, but eventually you're going to end up with an empty account. So each elements of these must be considered if the concept is successful. And there's a number of steps in that full cost recovery framework. One is to establish service levels. What level of service does your customers require or wish? If you don't know what service level you provide, it's very difficult to determine the cost of providing that service. So In that, after determining service levels, determine the costs, determine the revenue sources, need to gain public acceptance for the increases which may well be required, and then actually implement the program. So this graphic here really sort of demonstrates that in a graphical manner. Need to establish service level. That determines the cost. Need to balance the cost with the revenue. And then after that, we can implement the necessary measures, but you need to get the customer acceptance, okay, and buy-in to those measures. If not, okay, then the board or your elected officials, your governors, etc., will likely have a hard time agreeing or approving, okay, the likely program. So that brings us really to part 3, which is communicate with the public, elected officials, and other stakeholders. And we recognize there's a large number of stakeholders involved in the business of a water utility. Everything from suppliers, lenders, community, customers, owners, government, and employees as well. They're also a stakeholder. So we felt it was very important that the utilities' needs, challenges, and their solution, okay, be communicated in a way whereby people can understand it. And you know, I'm an engineer. Sometimes I use engineer speak, which is perhaps not the most effective way of communicating. Okay, so we need to communicate in a way which gains understanding and acceptance of whatever measures and programs are required. We recognize that any strategy really needs to identify the customer barriers and gaps. Okay, what is the average customer likely to know? What are they likely to care about? You know, what are they going to be their issues if, say, water rates increase? We need to confirm. You need to confirm stakeholders and communicate. And I underlined that with them. Communicate in a way whereby they can engage and understand the message which you're trying to push across. So some key messages, and the media is out there. The media can be very effective and very a positive influence in you trying to communicate your programs to your customers and stakeholders, or they can be very negative. So it's better to get ahead of that, engage with the media as early as possible. So then part 4 already was moving forward. You know, what do we do now? Okay, and one of the, as I mentioned at the beginning, we identified a number of issues for further development, whereby research, additional work, further work by CWA and advocacy by CWA would be beneficial. One was affordability. I mentioned earlier about the challenges in some lower income, disadvantaged groups, okay, to ensure that programs are targeted and effective in helping those groups. Impacts of climate change. Climate change is such a huge subject, okay, that it's very difficult to provide guidance on every aspect. We felt that the impacts of climate change would benefit from further work on that. Workforce development. This is a subject, okay, which our committee, a subset of our committee, has been working very, very hard on, and Valerie is part of that group as well. And they come up with some very interesting aspects, challenges, and suggestions, okay, for utility. And we're actually going to be publishing a guidance document similar to this one, just on workforce development. There's been more and more recognition of the value of natural infrastructure to water systems. Okay, if an aquifer was to disappear, if source water protection was not recognized, if those watersheds were paved over, you know, what would it actually cost to replace them? It could be a huge number. So trying to incorporate that into a cost benefit analysis is a challenge. and we felt that more work on that would be advantageous. Lastly, communicating the value of water. This ties into the FRED, a subject which extends all the way through our document. And there are some extremely good communication materials out there. We found, though, they were largely designed for the USA, and we wanted to tailor something which would be more suitable for Canadian utilities and customers. So lastly, or almost lastly, the guidance documents tend to be a living document. It's not meant to be static. We intend to add more materials, references, etc. as time goes on. We're looking for suggestions from our membership there. And there was actually a webinar series as well, which was held late last year. And that can be viewed at cwwa.ca. Free of charge. It's really available for anybody who wants to delve further into these subjects. And lastly, one of the things we thought would be useful to include in the guidance document is a self-assessment tool. Okay, this gives some broad categories and allows utility, just as a start, okay, just initial assessment of how they're doing on that journey to sustainability. So that's the end of my presentation. Hopefully you found it useful and interesting, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Right, thank you very much, Carl, for this very comprehensive presentation. And I think there are so many things that you brought out here, which are in principle quite relevant to our own work and some discussions we've been having along the way, even this morning, on the question of communicating the value of water to the public, as well as how to interact with public elected officials, etc. The questions of leak detection and reduction as you look at the various strategies. So I think they're all very pointed and relevant to the work that we're doing. Just in terms of, I think it was to do with I think you had one section on pricing and affordability.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of the regulatory framework, how is it that I think you mentioned to increase the relationship with customers, the customer relationship. How are you able to maneuver through all of this to get equilibrium, as it were?
I think maneuvering is a good term, Ignatius. Yeah. It does depend somewhat, okay, upon the regulatory environment, okay, which we do have different models across the country, actually, in terms of how regular water price increases are taken forward. In most cities, okay, it's basically the council who has to approve any water rate increases. So in that case, the staff, the utility staff, which would be in the city, would develop the business case, okay, and the need for it, and then take it to the council, and they would have to approve it. In some jurisdictions like Nova Scotia, there's actually a Public Utilities Commission, okay, which is separate to any council, but any approval any increases have to be passed by them and approved by them.
Yeah, that's very similar to the NERC in St. Lucia.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, very good, very good. Yeah. In my experience, okay, the ones which have been successful in getting water rate increases through are those utilities where the leaders have engaged early and frequently with elected officials, okay, with the Utilities Commission, etc. If one leaves it to the last minute, okay, elected officials will normally say, no, I don't think that's necessary, or I need to consult with my my constituents. Okay, I think if the utility leadership engage with them early, brings them into the discussion, what does this mean to your constituents? Then I think that, that by the time it actually gets to a vote in the council or approval by the utility commission, then is a lot more likely to succeed.
Can I make an extra point there as well, Ignatius? The utilities very often are very, very bad of making what Carl was talking about, the business case, and doing a cost benefit analysis. I always say that when you go in and you keep asking for things, all that is what I call whining. And we need to get much better at making that business case. And going back to the EUM program that we did last week, that's one of the things that we do. If anybody's on from Dominica and went through that, where we say, okay, here's how you make the business case. If you've only given so much money, how do you set priorities? So, and Carl's absolutely right. You've got to get out there in front. And that's when we were working with Dominica, we were saying, and they've done a great job of taking some of those learnings and developing a communication plan. A communication plan isn't something you do a month before you got a rate increase coming. It is a continual effort. And this is something I think Carl and I agree on totally.
Yes.
I don't see it being done nearly enough.
Yeah. And it's actually, if I can just add to that, okay, it's not just prior to the rate increase. I think after the rate increase is just as important to show the elected officials, the governors, the utility board, that the good use, okay, to which that additional investment has been put to. Okay, that'll hopefully help the next rate increase.
Well, participants, the floor is yours. Do you have any questions, please?
Yes, I have a couple of questions.
Go ahead, Mr. Benny.
Right. The CWWA, the companies, the water companies, are they state-run or are they public-private companies? How do they operate?
Okay.
That's
sorry to interrupt. Yeah, in the vast majority of cases, they are actually publicly owned. Okay, either through directly by the municipality, okay, or through some sort of public utilities commission, as we say them, which normally the municipality is a major stakeholder. But we have very, very few systems which are privately run or privately owned. We do have some systems, not too many, but some where there's private operators, okay, private operations companies, but the assets, okay, the pipes, the treatment plants, etc., still remain in public hands.
okay. So your model, if that is the model that you are using there, it has to be robust, because in the Caribbean, most of our systems are like that. But yet we are not able to have a sustainable water company in most cases. So the regulators and the public information has to be on par, or at least better than what we do here in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I think you hit upon a very important point there, Mr. Benny, in that, and I don't know the Caribbean water systems that well, okay, but I think that the needs and the benefits, I always look upon it as the benefits and the risks, okay, and if you have a sustainable system, okay, there's significant benefits which we should make the customers, stakeholders, utility regulators, etc., aware of. But there's also substantial risks if that investment isn't put forward. Okay, it could be public health issues, it could be damage to the environment, and I think we have to point out both the bad things that can happen if there's negative investment as well as the good things.
Well, the governance structure has to be able to do a lot with it, because when you compare your model with the models that are presently in the UK,
yes,
water companies in the UK are out to make a profit. It's not
Yes.
just full cost recovery,
No.
right?
Yeah.
So the paradigm is different. In Trinidad, I can talk to Trinidad scenario. Our company is run, it's a statutory board, but it runs not on economic sustainability. Most of the time, the subventions are from the state. So in terms of making some of those decisions that you all make there, it is not left to the managers at the utility. It's more based on the governance model of the country, as per se in Trinidad.
Yeah. And I think the governance is a very important factor. I think you're perfectly correct there. And a lot of these governance models are historical. That's the way it was set up, right in the beginning, by beginning. And I think for a governance model, okay, to be successful, and therefore the utility to be successful, there has to be recognition that times have changed, okay, that customer expectations have changed, the environment, okay, the economic situation has changed, okay. So it may be a very challenging, okay, thing, but examining the governance model for a utility may be a very worthwhile exercise. And in fact, I can think of a few utilities here in Canada, okay, where they've actually changed their governance model just in the last few years or so because they realized that the previous one wasn't the best.
Right.
The big problem has always been political will on the rates and tariffs. And Carl, so many of the utilities are running off rates that were set 14 years ago, and the government will not allow rate increases to go through because they think they're going to lose votes. What is encouraging right now, I think, is that and Ignatius chime in, the CDB and the IDB are now starting to say, if you want more money from grants and loans, you better have a sustainable rate structure. Mm-hmm. And I think until that happens in the Caribbean, and the pressure is on governments to start looking at the rate and tariffs and making it more sustainable, nothing's going to change. Everybody's going to be on the verge of bankruptcy at all times. So that's encouraging, though, that the banks are saying, you've got to start getting your act in place. Ignatius, can you comment on that?
Well, yeah, of course, there are some countries more than others, and as you go to places like Belize and Jamaica,
yeah,
Trinidad and, well, not Trinidad and Tobago, but St. Lucia, Grenada have about just a couple of years ago, they got themselves a regulator. Because what you have happening in many of the regions is that you do not have, the utilities were still self-regulatory. So that to be able to get into accessing development financing, you had to begin to change the structures, the governance structures. And so that has been happening gradually. I mean, the OUR in Jamaica has a very good track record and perhaps one of the better regulators. In Barbados, of the Fair Trade Regulator, the Office for Fair Trade Regulation, I think it's called in Barbados, they have now about 2 years ago been made the regulators for the water sector, water and wastewater. So I think it's taking shape because it also gives all the parties, the government, the public, consumers, and all the parties can see there's a degree of independence and in setting rates, and it is not the dictate of the state, perhaps. And that augurs well in getting the utilities to be able to cover at least their operational expenses. There are some utilities that are really badly hemorrhaging because they aren't able to cover their operational expenses let alone if they're not able to do that, then there's nothing left to do any type of capital investment in infrastructure.
Right.
And so I think there's increased awareness about these. And when one look at if you go to the websites of Belize Water Services or even the Cayman Water, the Water Authority of the Cayman Islands, you could see the difference that's happening. In Jamaica, I think the government of Jamaica a couple of years ago, when we were at CWWA in Jamaica, did indicate their intention to begin to restructure the NWC Jamaica so that it would be able to attract other capital financing, so that they didn't have to do as much borrowing, so that it could be more public participatory and tap into other types of financing that is available, pension funds, etc., where people can, private sector can invest. So the public-private partnership arrangements are also welcome. But I think also the myth of that private sector approach alone will be the panacea for water utilities. I think that myth has been debunked over the years, and I think people are realizing what is required to make public utilities work is a lot more than that. And it can work if you are able to put in the right structures, the governance, and give the utilities the opportunity to operate within a conducive environment with minimal undue influence by elected officials.
Yeah.
So it is happening, and I think there's a greater consciousness, particularly through the CWWA, that's Caribbean, at the HLF, the High Level Forum annually. I think there are lots of issues that have been coming up, and I think the utility, the ministers, the line ministers responsible for water have increased their awareness, and I think are beginning to get converted about a lot of the issues that need to make public utilities work. In fact, a couple of years, well, more than a couple of years, I think it was 5 years ago, through support of the CDB and IDB, we hosted what we call water leaders type conference for 2 years with support from the CDB. And it was also bringing across all the utility managers and people involved in consultancies, and to share the kind of advice, because until you build that kind of culture, you're not going to make the changes. And herein lies some of what we are doing through this type of medium with support from Operators Without Borders.
Yeah, one of the things on the governance that I think is very, very difficult in the Caribbean is that so many of the general managers are under a contract. And so there's not a lot of impetus for them to really stand up and be counted against government and fight for something when they can be let go at any time and somebody else put in. So that's a very, very difficult situation. I think that we don't have that in Canada. Generally, a general manager or water utility manager is a civil servant, and they're not going to be let go any minute. So that's a very, very difficult situation in the Caribbean. And it comes to, David, what you were talking about, the government structure.
Yes, it is.
It gets down to well, of utilities also setting within the governance system to have the look at performance indicators. And another thing that we have been striving towards, and we've not been able to get it off the ground, is the sort of performance benchmarking. The IDB has started with a couple of utilities. It's a sort of pilot looking at a system they have called the Aqua Rating System. And we have a couple of utilities are now going in there so that they can, it's a sort of internal examination of your performances with and which in the end you can be benchmarked against other similar type utilities. So these are things that are necessary. So because if you aren't able to measure, you won't be able to manage, that concept.
I noticed that Elvin Roberts has his hand up here.
Yes, please, Elvin. Out of St. Vincent, recovering from the volcanic eruption, and he did work down there.
Yes, good afternoon. I was just wondering something in terms of cost, maintenance cost, basically. What is the possibility of the utilities in the region, the various islands, coming together to order pipes and fittings for maintenance purposes, like in bulk, whether or not that will be beneficial to us in driving down the cost of these pipes and fittings? I'm not sure if at any time any thought went into this, or if you can help me out in terms of how possible it might be for us to come together to purchase these items whereby we might get them at a reduced cost.
Well, that's one good question, Elvin. I think it's a matter that's just recently we had one of the utilities, I think, has written to his colleague utility managers with such a proposal. I can't say at what stage it is at now, but we are always prepared to give the kind of support at the CAWASA in sort of coordinating such an activity. Some of what has happened with the Caribbean Development Bank and with the IDB through a series of webinars that was held last year looking at non-revenue water, that matter came up. And one of the follow-up action was to meet with the grouping outside of within the US. I think it's an company that does a sort of has a sort of application, a web application where utilities can exchange information on inventories, particularly in times of disasters, and in terms of sources of procurement. But it is something that has been put on the agenda by water leaders at CWWA conferences, and about a week ago, we had a utility manager writing to his colleagues about pursuing such an agenda. So it's still at a stage above my pay grade to elaborate on it, but it's something that is on the table.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, colleagues? Comments? There being none, if you don't have any others, I'd like to thank on behalf of all of us at CAWASA and all of you who participated. I'd like to thank Mr. Carl Bodimeade for giving us this presentation and some insights into some things that we need to continue pursuing in our region. And I'd like to thank Valerie for coordinating, as always, giving us that support with finding us some good presenters, good speakers, well-informed, and people with lots of experience. So thank you for sharing that with us, Valerie.
Yeah, and I have shared the guidance document, the actual document, not just the PowerPoint. I just sent that to you, and you're welcome to disseminate that to everybody.
Okay, we'll do when I send at the same time, I will send the recording, circulate the recording to participants. So thanks to all of you. Keep safe and well. And I'm Ignatius Jean, Executive Director at CAWASA, signing off, and we'll keep in touch.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Pleasure to talk to you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you again.
Bye.